Shayne, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Christian, great to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Of course, I'm excited to catch up with you on intellectual endeavors. It's been a long time since we last caught up, and I'm very excited about your field of study. I think that, I'm an AI geek for sure, and I think it's a big monster that has many domains that you can deep dive on. But I think that the one that you're tackling is one that often gets overlooked in the bigger conversation around AI, but it's so absolutely foundational. So why don't we begin with the basic question I always ask, Shayne, what do you do?
Oh, the hardest question. I lately have been thinking a lot about, so first and foremost, I'm a research scientist. I'm in my PhD at MIT. But lately I've been thinking a lot more about societal impact of AI, maybe legal implications of how we're building AI. And what got me into those was looking at the underlying data that powers the AI system. So traditionally, data is the least sexy thing in AI. It's all about architectures and models and like fancy tooling. But lately, there's more and more realization that all of this is down to data. It really doesn't matter that much. Everybody's using more or less the same architectures, the same methods, the same ideas, whether it's text, whether it's image, whether it's video, whether it's speech. But the thing that powers it all is data at massive scale. And so for my PhD and for my research, I've been looking more deeply into how to acquire data, which data to use and not to use, given your requirements, your ethical and legal considerations, how to optimize it for your tasks. Is it multilingual? Is it one language? What are you actually doing? And so there's a technical side of that, optimizing the data for getting the best performance, but then there's also the responsible and ethical and legal side of that. And so I've been thinking all about that and sort of the origin of the AI supply chain, which comes from the data.
And I think that's fascinating because we have this giant corpus of human knowledge that we've accrued over, millennia of knowledge, right? Some of these texts are incredibly ancient, but there's like contrasting views on certain things. There's like very wide-ranging quality on the, you can't compare the Divine Comedy to some Reddit shitpost, right? And so there's some kind of thing that you have to do, some kind of pre-processing that you need to do as an AI, if you're trying to build one of these AI foundation models, to make sure that there's some kind of normalization between the data. So what is that? You're in the space. What does that look like in practice today for research scientists that are trying to build these AI models? What do these data sets look like? How are they organized? And what does the entire space look like?
Yeah. Let me start with how they're organized. So most of the data we use is sourced from the web or other massive libraries, repositories, licensed data, huge, GitHub, like all the different code repositories that are public and commercially available, all the different social media platforms like Reddit and others, and maybe YouTube that provide different content or content that can be crawled and scraped. And then repositories of books and news organizations that will license a lot of their content. It comes from such a mishmash of different areas of, as you said, all different, very, heterogeneous. But there's kind of competing forces. So people want to organize these and put them all in one big repository of data, one big corpus. And initially, when people started developing these models, they wanted to filter it aggressively for toxicity, for quality, for all the bad. The web is primarily pornography. And so obviously we want to get rid of all of that. We don't want our models to be, just this cesspit. We want to build things that are useful and helpful to people in many ways. And so people started filtering aggressively. But then they realized that the more aggressively you filter, you actually reduce the quality of your overall model for general purpose tasks because scale helps. The more data you have in general can be helpful. And also when you try to filter things out, you end up filtering out not just some things you might not want, but many other things, and maybe marginalized communities and minority voices. And the first model, I think T5, that was one of the first that was more generative in its nature in 2019, they trained in the colossal cleaned Common Crawl. And for that model, they had a list of words that if they found it in a document, they would nix that document and not include it in training. And one of the words was like sex. So this model didn't have any idea or very little idea, unless it was misspelled, about human or animal reproduction, basic things about the world that actually we want our models to know about. And people also realize that if we want our models to be able to understand when they're being asked something inappropriate or whether their answer might be inappropriate, maybe they should have some idea of what's on 4chan and what inappropriate things are. And so it's actually better to know those things in many cases to protect marginalized voices, understand what toxicity looks like, and to have that data scale. And so there's been a flip-flop of models in companies and elsewhere that have tried to filter aggressively, then they filter much less, and then try to build other tools to prevent the model from being biased. And it's this whole sort of tug and pull that I think is really interesting.
It's so fascinating. This is a little tidbit that I quoted last episode too, but I found out from a Chinese researcher that the Chinese sanctioned AI training has a lot more keywords that are censored effectively,
Really?
and one of them is Tiananmen Square. And so, but there's a causal chain of events from Tiananmen Square that essentially affected the timeline of things, so that these models actually have really bad, holes in their knowledge that are things that derived from Tiananmen Square, because they have no access to that thing. It's kind of like this event horizon in their cognition.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting that we had something similar here in the West, but that eventually, and I think this is also kind of a byproduct of the arms race that is taking place with AI. That is you want to build AI superiority. The model needs to know the things, right? Even if they're horrible, then we'll trust the model to hold off the horror, which is a crazy thing in and of itself. So you recently launched or released a paper around data provenance and how there's very little, let's call it coordination, around the stakeholders involved in the sourcing of this data for training these models. And I thought it was fascinating because this it's a non-trivial issue any way you look at it, right? We could look at copyright, we could look at authenticity, we could look at some of the metadata and how some training data is weighed more heavily than others. We could look at quality. So I would love for you to give a little bit of a landscape picture of what the space of stakeholders is, and then maybe we could get into some of these issues that you point out in the paper that I think are so enlightening.
Yeah, for sure. Let me quickly add one thing, because you had a really interesting comment before about the Chinese models, and I think you hit something on the head, which is everybody right now wants their own ideologically processed model. Everybody wants a model that speaks their language, reflects their values, and they're not really content right now with the models that Google and OpenAI are creating. There's been several controversies about, how those models have reflected certain historical events, things like that the media have taken them to account for. As you said, that can have really big consequences downstream if we have all these models. And I think that companies like OpenAI and Google may want to go the way of social media, where they begin to have different models or different aspects that reflect the laws and the values in different countries, so they can capture more markets. They may also want to personalize, and they're already working on this, like one of their models. And so we see a lot of people are going to get their own values and preferences reflected right back at them, for better or for worse. And that's something to keep into account. In terms of data provenance and the stakeholders, I would say that the major stakeholders are big companies that want to train AI models, governments that want to train AI models, universities and others that want to train AI models, And we're seeing differentiation where people want to train their own models from scratch, or they want to train, fine tune, or augment models that big companies are creating for them that are kind of a blank slate but have all that power baked into them. But then in the creator front, there are many different creators and organizations that are academic labs, nonprofits, government entities, all the above that are creating data or trying to commercialize, commoditize their data, or just put it out, for wider use. And then on top of that, there's a tier of sort of academics that are organizing, creating that data into data sets, processing it in different ways. And what we find is between the data creators and the data organizers, there is complete chaos. So we looked, for example, in the Hugging Face platform where data sets are collected and tried to measure how many of them have licenses that are reflected how the original dataset creators intended. And it's a 65% omission or error rate. So not to say that all those licenses are enforceable, but if you wanted to respect them, there's no infrastructure in place right now to be able to trace what people's intentions were when they created or packaged or released the data. So there's some people want to call it license or data laundering, they're repackaged in many different ways. New licenses are stamped on top. And so everything is just the Wild West right now.
See, that's great. And then what's the regulatory aspect? So so I think that copyright is the thing that comes to mind, and this is coming from the lawsuits of the big record labels just issued to Suno and Udio, the AI music generators that obviously trained on their data, but then it becomes a really complex legal question. But I think it's the most prescient one. If there's an issue that is probably going to drive the conversation forward, it's going to be the profit-seeking, dispositions of both the AI research complex and the copyright holders. There's a side quest there that is the validity of copyright in the information age and how we didn't really get that right and how we. That's a whole other question. But where does the copyright litigation fall into this spectrum? Have we started? We saw a few. Is it becoming more prevalent? What's the state of that?
Yeah. So I'll quickly say that I'm not a lawyer, but I have been hearing lots of smart lawyers talk about this. And I've been hearing lots of people that are in startups and building things talk about this. And I can safely say that there's a wide spectrum of opinions, informed or otherwise. The two sort of spectrums, the far ends, and you might have already spoken or heard about this in your previous podcast, but one is the right to learn, and do machines have the right to be inspired and learn the same way humans do? We have the right to go to the New York Times or to read a book and to be inspired by it and go and write our own material. We can't plagiarize it. That would be a violation. But we can go be inspired and write things based off the knowledge, inspiration, and learning from their style, all those things. A human can do that. And most people agree for the most part, that's viable. And so some people want that to be the case for machines. However, that sort of negates the entire idea of consent in many cases, depending on how it's used. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have people that say consent should be respected no matter what. So no matter what they created data for, or they wrote something, they published a blog online, or whatever it is, that in any case, no matter, even if you're a journalist or a researcher, if you didn't give them consent or machine consent to read it, then it should be respected. And I think that the reality is not all data is created equal. And so it really depends on a number of questions. How was the data created and what was it created for? To what extent is the person that created it, is it part of their livelihood, or are they making money off of it? And to what extent are the people that are using that data using it for the same means or for different means? Is it a transformative use? It's a question in fair use in the US. And are they commercializing it, or are they studying it, or are they doing non-commercial things with it? And there's a whole spectrum of different uses that need to be thought through here. So I think it's very difficult. So I spoke to some lawyers and they said, they think the New York Times OpenAI case, like it might not be just a binary thing. It might go one way, but there's a bunch of caveats. And that means that a series of other lawsuits will have to come up and explore those caveats and see if those conditions are met for other types of data. So it's very, very complicated. And I just would warn people against taking binary conclusions at one end of the spectrum or the other.
I couldn't agree more. I think I think the whole issue of copyright in general is like a thing that we have been punting down the line, as in like, it effectively became an instrument to control the spread of information, and it has been enforced, in geopolitically to enforce certain trade agreements and whatnot. And so like the spirit of the law seems to be very different from the actual letter of the law, and I don't know that. And now we're faced with another revolution that sort of like that forces us to reassess these things. But it's not it's not simple, right? Like, because you want to protect the inventiveness of creators, but you also want to make sure that good ideas and the best ideas are widely distributed, right? And so so there's a very difficult balance there, and there you get into weird things too, like the consent of people who are long gone, and what do we do about that? Like things that are in the public domain, how do we arrive at that? And like, this is like, it's a whole crazy thing, but I don't want to derail it too much, because I think that's where the conversation naturally goes. But I'm really interested in the more like the metadata cleaning side of things, and the authenticity, and determining, I mean, how do these models determine the relative value of a given piece of training data versus another, and what efforts are done in the meantime by academics or by researchers broadly to organize this data. Any thoughts there?
A few, and I'll second what you said. I think that copyright, many people think, is like very boring, when they first, hear about it. But right now, like, these lawsuits are governing so much about the widespread use and adoption of information. Like, there's so much power encapsulated in some of these principles, and they go much beyond just, what some AI model will do or can do. So as for what people are trying to do in terms of organization, there's a couple of big initiatives that are underway. One is trying to unlock more data. So a incredible amount of data is locked behind PDFs. It is actually a massive issue, because not, OCR, the ability to like take a PDF and translate it back into the text that's actually on the page, so a machine can read it more easily, because PDFs are not easy for machines to read by default, is something that some big companies have great models, but it's actually still a challenging thing to do, especially if the PDFs had handwriting and different fonts and things like that. And so there's a tremendous challenge for people that are taking PDFs and trying to generate the original text. And in many cases, if just the Word documents were released, it would be so much easier in the first place to go get these huge repositories of government documents and unlock all the power and knowledge within them that supposedly should already be public domain in many cases. So that's one big initiative, acquire the data that is kind of on the web or is in huge repositories, but not really accessible because of the format. It's really as boring as that. Another initiative is to try to disentangle parts of the web that are public domain and commercially licensed from the types that are not. So which parts can we train on as an AI company, and which parts can we not? Now, in reality, this is a very murky issue on two spectrums. One, legally, how are you using it? Or is it for non-commercial? What the laws are, what you respect. It does get murky in some places, and it's ambiguous. But secondly, it's hard to do, because when you go to a web page, literally how they're doing it now is they're looking, first off, they read the robots.txt file. For those that don't know, there's a machine readable file that most websites have that tells you which subsets of the website you can crawl or not. Not legally enforced, but most crawlers respect it. You go in, you copy those documents, you have a web page now, and then you have different elements of the web page. You have different text, you have different sections, you have images, videos, whatever. And they look for, like, with regular expressions, various parts of those web pages that might be, have a Creative Commons, commercially available license, some that don't. And they try to figure out which parts can and can't be trained on.
Via regular expressions?
That's how a lot of this is working right now. Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, regular expression is kind of like a coded search query where you're just matching. You're essentially looking character by character to see if a pattern is matched. So this is kind of like it's kind of an insane thing because you're running what does that regular expression even look like?
I mean, it's really not. It's pretty simple. It's like, can we find a string that matches certain licenses that say that things are viable?
Oh, I see. So you're just looking for the license to know if you can use the page wholesale. Got it. That's what it's. I thought you were talking like element wise, Anyway.
Well, it's element. It's a very atomic. It's like every web page on the web and trying to disentangle various facets of it. Basically, it's so hard to do this right now. There's not a good way to say, here's all the good data, here's all the bad data. Even if you take a New York Times article or an artist's pictures, if they're remotely famous, they're going to be copied thousands of times across the web in various web pages that don't cite them, maybe don't put the license. So what people are trying to do now is, can we have like a hash, like an individual code or key for every piece of information on the web? Like an atomic hash for this picture.
Type of thing.
Exactly. And so that's important not just for disentangling copyright and consent, but also for authenticity right now. So people want to know whether something was real, a real picture, or whether it was generated by a machine. Same with text, same with video. That is one of the scariest things related to AI. That there's a whole nother tangent. But
so there's two layers of authenticity, right? There's the machine made versus human made, and then there's real human made versus doctored human made, right? Because like there's like a fuzzy in between there layer where like,
what's doctored human? Do you mean
like a photoshopped image? Like a like there's this person wasn't really there, like So there's an underlying issue around authenticity, which is like, I think, even more interesting as we're like building out these systems that will be able to handle a lot more information that we can. That systems should have the ability to determine what is authentic and isn't. Call bullshit on their own training data, and this is an incredibly difficult thing to do because then it gets very quickly into axiomatic values like truth and whatnot, and how do you ascertain truth? And it's like actually pretty difficult. But I think it's really interesting that there's like the watermarking case of like, you make sure that anything that an AI model produces has an indicator of some sort, like a paper trail that it was made by an AI, versus well, I guess human systems don't have that. And if you were trying to create something false, you would never leave your mark anyway. But at least with AI, you could like enforce that. I wanted to. So this seems to. I'm really interested in this stuff because I think that like the stuff. We think of data as being static, right? We think of data as being like a chunk that is, like a sort of like a piece of information about the world that is static. But I like to think of, like when these models are consuming data, the data is actually a software. It's actually code that that is informing the model to, to relearn its priors. Like it's updating its probability models based on the things that it consumed. And so there's a world in which we do it right, and the data that we feed these models leads to something really good. And then there's a world in which we do it wrong, and we start seeing problems that could be from silly things like the like the Gemini controversy, two more dangerous things where like really weird and wrong biases start showing up because of how we did our data curation wrong. Do you have thoughts on the difference between the two? Given that you're in this space and you like the, this is the raw materials building this giant Tower of Babel type of thing we're doing, about the how one world looks versus the other.
Yes. First off, I'll say that there is no perfect right or wrong. As hard as one might try, you cannot reach it. All data is biased in some way, and it is a impossible task to try to have the, as the EU AI Act in the initial draft said, error-free data. How does one know what is error-free in Reddit or not? It's insurmountable. But, and I'll use an example here from that I heard about an anonymous, AI tech company that was building text-to-image models. In the first iteration, they built models that didn't filter, very much data. And they're like, oh my God, there's all this toxic, horrible stuff in here. In particular, women become incredibly sexualized in all of the images that we generate. It is pseudo-pornographic at times, and this is not, clear biases here. This isn't reflective of the kind of model that we want in our society. And so then they're like, we're going to aggressively filter for all of the content that makes that's like sexualized on the web. And it just so happens that the web itself is very asymmetric. Pictures of women on the web are predominantly more sexualized or wearing fewer clothes than men. And so when you filter all that out, you get a much smaller corpus of women that remain. It's like you have, all these pictures of men, very few pictures of women. And that's an artifact of our society. But when they do that, trying to do the right thing, all of a sudden it can't even generate like a high fidelity woman, but it can generate men really well because they have such a small sample of women. And so becomes this huge trade-off and tug and pull to try to get the model to do the right thing. And I think we will get to a place where models are more data efficient and can be steered to get more out of the data points that we think are more reflective. But we are going to be on this path that's zigzagging to try to find that balance. It's not a simple solution where some people are like, you should just filter everything out, or you should just do something else. And so it's actually quite complicated. And data curation is a highly technical thing that I think is going to, I believe in startups that are working on data curation at scale. I think that is the meat and potatoes behind what's going to make AI really useful and great, or the general purpose models at least.
That's so interesting. That I mean, it really goes to show like how incorrect our intuitions around data are, right? Like I think this is like kind of on the cognitive science aspect of things, but like how much information is out there that we don't know about, that or think about it, just like how much stuff is in your subconscious that is affecting your daily decisions that you don't think about. And try and find the asymmetry between like whatever you're conscious of and whatever you're not conscious of is probably way more stuff that you're not conscious of. But then if you think about all the agents interacting in the global system that we're a part of, like that's a lot of subconscious, non-processed stuff that we're all working with. And, some of that stuff leaks places. I think the internet is a reflection of that, like with places of high enlightened discourse, like archive versus of cesspools like 4chan or the entire pornographic side of the internet. And I think that like when we're building this thing, like when we're praying to this AI god, like we really hope that our reflection, the thing we see back, is the best version of ourselves, right? Like the version of us that doesn't have all the annoying biases and like all the things that we feel self-conscious and insufficient about. And I think that is one of the things that I really like about the AI conversation is that it forces you to look inside to see, like, wait a minute, these are my preconceptions of the world. This is how I think power works. This is it's like a compression mechanism to unpack a series of really interesting rabbit holes to pursue. Um, and I do think that if we get it wrong, that the outcome can be actually quite catastrophic, right? Like, we could be playing into the parts of ourselves that are optimized for short-term gain versus long-term gain. And this would be a tragedy if we do it with a system that can have, global reach within millisecond. However, if we get it right, then this could also be a gigantic impact multiplier for any of our endeavors, right? Like, if we have a system that is like reflecting at us of the best version of us and trying to constantly put us in the right wavelength, let's call it, to lead the Eliezer Yudkowsky sort of like the best version of ourselves, if we could be that version of ourselves and hold that version of ourselves, I think that's really exciting. And then there's another thing there that you mentioned too around the exclusion principle on data that most often backfires, is that, well, we have now is the ability to build these gigantic foundation models that will have all these biases, but at least we'll have some reflection of accuracy that then we can fine tune to then accommodate our cultural biases, let's call it, right? And I think that's something that, like, we're only beginning to explore that. These foundation models are like a couple years old, and there's who knows how much research there is to be done just in seeing how much these fine tuning can, like, how much mileage these fine tunings can give you, right? So if you had to make a call, like, you're in the data space, and let's say I'm starting a foundation model company. What are some of the best practices that you would hope I would adopt as I'm building a new foundation model?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll plug some of the work that I've done with colleagues I think is relevant here. I think that being very cognizant of where you're sourcing your data, be transparent with your principles, stand by them, say what they are, and then, source data according to those. You can use tools like the Data Provenance Initiative's Explorer tool to help find data sets that match those criteria. Another thing is transparency. So there's a big war right now in the community about how transparent AI developers should be, and about mainly, not just the data and the inputs, but the labor, the compute that went into it, as well as the actual modeling techniques, the uses, who's actually using it, what sort of evaluations or risk assessments have they done. The Foundation Model Transparency Index was sort of widely covered as looking into that. We've also released a foundation model, responsible foundation model development cheat sheet, which has tools all along the spectrum of development that tells you different tools that you can build, or look into if you care about, fingerprinting, watermarking, data documentation, data sourcing, how to efficiently benchmark your computational environmental costs, like all the things that you might want to do if you want to be, as responsible as possible. The tools are out there. And so I'd point people to these works, to be transparent, consult all the tools that are out there that help you do things that are good. Yeah, I think those are the main things I would say.
It's really interesting because I think that there's almost a disincentive to start a foundation model company, in the sense that these are the pool of people who can actually effectively do this is very small, first of all. Then you come to the second part, that these are incredibly capital intensive training runs, right? Like, these are, to be competitive, I think you have to be in the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. If you want to have a dream of competing against OpenAI or Anthropic, right? So the subset of there's a Venn diagram that is a very small surface area of people who want to do it. But I also agree that like the prize there is gigantic, right? Like if your model has promise, like even seeing dynamics like OpenAI kind of losing a little bit of the limelight to Anthropic in the last few months. I think that actually the fact that there's some dynamism and mobility there is actually quite encouraging for people to build out these things that become foundational technologies, kind of like the internet was, right? And but I also, and what do you feel about the fact that the industry, at least OpenAI, certainly Anthropic, certainly Google, that they seem to be trending more toward the social media trend of things, where these models are very closed, they're proprietary, they're hidden behind layers upon layers of confidentiality, NDAs, and all this stuff. Even the parameter for some GPT-4, we don't really know, right? Like we have estimates, but we don't know for sure. What are your thoughts on, first of all, that, and then what could we do to prompt these big tech players to be more transparent?
Yeah, I think that there are many speculations and observed risks and harms of AI systems. The reason why that's the case is for two reasons. One, these systems are very general purpose. They're used for so many different things. They are a chatbot. You can type anything into them and get presumably almost anything out. We don't know all the use cases of them because we don't have a lot of naturalistic data. So there could be children in schools, there could be people in all different countries and places using them and getting bad outcomes or being given terrible medical advice, who knows? And we don't really know right now because there's a lack of independent red teaming and research on these systems. So they're dangerous because they're general purpose, and they're dangerous because OpenAI in the first few weeks have like 100 million plus weekly users. It's much higher than that now. Google has baked in Gemini into their products, spanning billions of users now. So the reach and the general purpose-ness of it make it kind of a very scary concoction. It's very similar. I'm going to make the analogy again to sort of social media in that sense, but rose much faster and could have even larger effects. So obviously, the companies and systems are saying we need to be very safe about this. It's very nascent. There are risks that we know that can happen because of these reasons. So we are doing all these things. But if you're going to say those things, you need to back it up. And so I think you need to back it up with solid transparency. You need to back it up with lots of evaluations, and some have made commitments and are doing that. But you also need to let the community evaluate these systems as well. And so that's, it's not, in my view, it's not necessarily a great indication of, our, team of 10, 20, 30, maybe even 100, our network of red teamers internally that are all based in SF or New York or London have done some red teaming, versus the actual communities that use it can go and red team these systems. So you might say, but can people go and do that? And to some extent, yes, but it varies by company to company. And it's limited because of a lack of transparency. Many people are actually afraid of hitting these models with difficult or challenging or the most risky inputs, because if the moderation system might flag them and they get their account suspended. And so if you're a researcher or a regular person, you get your account suspended, like that's, you're worried. You're violating terms of service. You could be banned, for a longer period of time. In Midjourney's case, people get banned, repeatedly. They lose money that they put into, using the system. That lack of openness, and also, all the tools that are put around it, can mean that maybe we don't have the healthiest environment to do that sort of like independent third-party journalism, red team, whatever you want to call it, that makes these systems strong, and that has been really helpful in the cybersecurity space. So we have things like bug crowd, security, vulnerability disclosure protocols and systems, whereby researchers in good faith can go and try all these things to try to break corporate systems. They let them know in advance when they found vulnerabilities, and as a result, things are much better. We don't have that right now for algorithmic audits or red teaming or AI, and I think that's a major vulnerability in the community.
That's it's also an interesting point, because like with cybersecurity stuff, where you have these bug bounties, like for every platform has these bug bounties where if you find an exploit and you report it and you're a good boy, you get paid a handsome fee. You oftentimes the fix for that is pretty simple. So often something like low level buffer overload, something like that. Like it's not. It's something that like an engineer can probably fix within, let's say, a week, to be super charitable. Now with AI, it's a much more difficult thing to debug, right? Like if there's a bias that is revealed, then where do you go? Do you go to the? Like there's so many layers, and the cost of fixing it means oftentimes retraining, which means not a week of an engineer's time if you're being super terrible, but it probably means like millions of dollars to rerun that. And you can't modularly rerun that part of the model, at least not with the current tech around explainability and whatnot. Maybe that'll improve in the future, but who knows? But I think that there's another interesting point there too, that is around that comes back to this idea of litigation, I think, where companies like Midjourney, companies like OpenAI, they're all very concerned about the impact of their technology, right? Like they're worried that the technology will be used for nefarious purposes, and it's very difficult to distinguish someone who's querying one of these systems for a nefarious purpose for real. How do I build the bomb? Versus somebody who's trying to see what happens if I were a bad guy and I tried to do, how would this enable me in order to prevent that from happening? So it gets back to this idea of like, how liable are these companies, and like how do we strike the right balance between permissiveness and the fact that some of this stuff could be really dangerous, and so what are your thoughts around the protocols? Like what would be the protocol for a company to predispose in this way?
Great questions. You honed in on two really key points. I'd say for further reading, I'll quickly mention that we put out a paper on this that's an oral at ICML, which is a prominent AI conference. And we put an open letter signed by many faculty at Stanford, Princeton, many other universities, prominent journalists, researchers, and the CEO of Hugging Face and like others that like supported that we need more infrastructure in this space, particularly going after this problem. But let me zoom in on the two questions you had. The security space has, in my mind, more or less found a comfortable, decades-long solution to the issue of finding the difference between good faith and bad faith researchers or red teamers. There's no reason why this can't be ported over almost identically. It's a bit of a like strong claim, but I think like for the most part it's true, to the AI or algorithmic bug bounty case. And the reason is because it's okay that security bugs are like more discreet, easier to fix. That's fine. We don't need to pay, researchers are finding dozens of bias issues a day. They don't need to be paid. And it's not necessarily a requirement that companies have to fix them or fix them immediately. Like that's something that's going to take time regardless. And so, you report a bug, I found that the model is sexist or racist or something, they're probably going to want to fix it. It might take them longer, but that's going to be part of the process. But we'd rather that the community is involved in doing that and has good infrastructure and ability and feels that there are no chilling effects preventing them from being engaging in that process. As to the question of how do we distinguish good and bad researchers, there's something called a safe harbor for good faith research that has become the norm in the security community. And if you abide by certain protocols, you tell the company when you find an issue in advance of you publishing it, you give them 60 days to respond, to like be aware, to like, do whatever with it. You also don't publish it in that period. If you find private user information, you delete it immediately and report it. You don't harm the actual production service of the company, i.e. you're not harming real users that are using it or do a denial of service attack. You don't red team models that are not currently available or public. You don't go in and hack their system into stuff that like isn't even public. There's a sets of rules. If you abide by those in security or in algorithmic vulnerability disclosure spaces, then you're guaranteed under a safe harbor that you wouldn't be sued under hacking laws. And companies have felt comfortable for the most part to say, yeah, if you follow all these things, we're not going to go after you. And so it seems like this is a very good thing that could be ported over to algorithmic and AI case. And if someone does violate those, which it's very easy to tell, then they're not covered by a safe harbor. And it's the same as if they were a malicious person in the first place. So it's about what people do rather than who they are. And you can tell whether people are doing something good or bad because they either go through a process or they don't. And you can either see that they follow the process or they don't. It's verifiable. So I think that this is a very tractable solution if people want to adopt it. But there might be a misincentive because tech companies would rather be the ones controlling the narrative in many cases, or they're understaffed, or there's many reasons.
Oh, yeah. And I think there's like another counter incentive there that, as opposed to cybersecurity that requires a pretty high degree of technical sophistication, we really don't know what the skill space required to red team an AI model is. And it seems to be way more, let's say, accessible than like hacking into the Linux kernel or something like that, where
For sure.
this is a linguistic device, and you could. I mean, like some of these exploits have been so fun to observe. Like the case where it's just what was it? Repeat the following phrase till the end of time, and it was like, I am bored, I am bored, I am bored, I am bored, and then at some point it just started spitting out training data or something, and so it requires a completely diagonal way of thinking that I think is way more accessible to people. And so the counter incentive there is all of a sudden you're going to have a lot more bugs to fix, and they're expensive bugs to fix if you are one of the big foundation model providers.
Well, let me add something there. Those bugs already exist. You're going to have to fix them at some point anyway. And the other thing is this, like you mentioned, like those exploits, some of them, as you said, are so simple. There's papers that show basic phrases, normal things people would engage with in non-English languages, a little bit down the stack of like not French, Spanish, and English. It's so much easier to get the models to misbehave in regular contexts and say all sorts of horrible things. And so people that are regularly living and trying these models, in their languages that are like not English, are seeing like pretty awful stuff. And we just like a mechanism where, people can be like, oh yeah, we should actually compile all those, send them to the company, and then publish them so people know, oh, it really sucks in Turkish. Do not, be aware that it's going to have all these terrible things that's going to be said. Like, I'd rather that be public knowledge at the end of the day, and a healthy community red teaming that anybody could do, rather than there be all these obstacles, no reporting mechanism, and like, certain things aren't ideal right now.
It's just so interesting. I mean, like my sister had a story where she was asking ChatGPT. They were just like essentially not red teaming, but trying to test the limits of like the cognition. What are the cognitive differences between LLMs and humans? She's at MIT too, by the way, and she asked in Guarani, which is the native tongue of Paraguay, what is your name? And ChatGPT responded, I am God. And so like there's all these fun, and Anthropic has like a whole fun of set of digressions around that, where you can tap into, you could really like find the latent space of where this thing operates, and then like there's a universe there to explore. And I think that like it's a I think I feel very grateful that there's been such a resurgence in these, or the prominence and like attention paid to these models, because the amount of learning, not just about how these systems emerge, but also what it says about us, I think it's just fascinating. I mean, like, there's going to be all kinds of research, not just in the prompt engineering side, but also, I think it's just very cool that we have this thing that we can point to, that is a wellspring of insight about our human condition. Okay, Shayna, I want to do a fake goodbye now, because because we're about to start talking about things that we can't talk about publicly yet. And so I want to say fake goodbye and thank you so much for the time so far. This has been great. I love these topics and I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for being on the show, man.
Hey, thanks for great questions, Cristian, and love talking with you about it.